Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Philip Byther, Curator for Performing Arts, and it's really nice to have you here. Tonight is the first night of a series of public programs we've called Merce Cunningham Across Media, and we hope you can join us the next few nights as well. Tomorrow, we turn to music, the music structures specifically used for the events in Cunningham events in general, but the events specifically that have been happening in the galleries. So we've got some musicians and curators involved with that. On Friday, we turn to experimental cinema, looking at the filmmaking of some avant-garde filmmakers who'd worked with Merce, in particular some rare films by Stan Vanderbeek. And Gloria Sutton from Northeastern University and John Kim from McAllister will be there to talk about those films. And on Saturday, we're hosting a 2 o'clock session called Creating in a Common Time. It offers panel presentations around Merce's collaborative work with visual artists, and it features Juliet Bello, Liz Kotz, Roger Copeland, and all facilitated by the show's co-curator, Joan Rothfuss. Also, please don't forget, the Cunningham events start up again on Thursday. It's the last week that you have a chance to see these remarkable dancers performing in the Perlman Gallery, what we've termed the studio, on Thursday in the evening as part of Photography Thursday Nights, Friday during the day at 1 and 4 at 1:30 and 4, and then again on Saturday and Sunday during the day. We'd like to mention that all of these programs, Merce Cunningham Across Media, are presented in conjunction, of course, with the Merce Cunningham Common Time show that is up and running right now at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago through April 30th, and here at the Walker through July 30th. So, and the show, I'm sure most of you may have seen it already, but it pays great dividends, going back time and again to it. We'd like to say thanks also to the Rauschenberg Foundation for their support of this entire series of programs this week. And also ongoing thanks to the Cunningham Trust for all their advice and support and commitment to this process and project. I also want to just say thanks to Mary Coyne, who's our Walker Cunningham Fellow, and to Curatorial Assistant in the Visual Art Department, Misa Jeffries, for all of their hard work and creativity in putting this program together as well. Tonight, we're really lucky to have a friend, colleague, great advocate and historian from Chicago, dance historian from Chicago, Bonnie Brooks. Bonnie is, besides an advocate and historian, an educator, a writer, and a term that I love that she's introduced me to, an audience dramaturg. And she will give us in a few minutes some opening thoughts around this evening's session, which will also feature Cunningham dancers Patricia Lent, Andrea Weber, and Silas Riener. Bonnie is currently the Associate Professor of Dance and Director and the lead curator of the Dance Presenting Series at Columbia College in Chicago. She chaired the college's dance department from the fall of 1999 through spring of 2011, at which point she took a year sabbatical and went off and hit the road with the Cunningham Dance Company as a legacy fellow, documenting and following their final world tour. Bonnie's essay, Dance Presenting and Dramaturgy, was published in Dance and Dramaturgy, Modes of Agency, Awareness, and Engagement by Palgrave Macmillan in August 2015. Aside from serving as a visiting assistant professor at World Arts and Cultures Department at UCLA from 96 to 99, she's also held a number of prestigious positions in the dance field, including the executive director of our national service organization, Dance USA, managing director, and I think when we first met, she was in this role for David Gordon Pickup Company. And much of us are still very grateful for the service she provided up here in the Twin Cities as the executive director of the Minnesota Dance Alliance from 1985 to 1988. She is, Bonnie started her career in the dance program at the National Endowment for the Arts, which I hope you all agree continues to need our total support, advocacy, and fight to save the agency. She holds a BA in Literature from Wheaton College in Illinois and a Master's of Arts degree in English from George Mason University. I know that in my years working with Merce, this has been decades now, when we thought of who can help explain Merce's work to an audience and who can articulate his artistry in a really effective way. One of the first names that came to mind was Bonnie Brooks. So would you please welcome Bonnie Brooks.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to be back in the Twin Cities. It always feels like coming home, even though I haven't lived here for a long time. And so thank you for inviting me to come, Philip. And we're going to have a great time this evening. I have just a few remarks that I put together to sort of contextualize this conversation with Trish and Andrea and Silas. And I thought it would be good. I'm sure you all wouldn't even be here if you didn't know something about Merce Cunningham, unless you wandered in off the street for some good reason, in which case we'll help you a little. But I thought it would be good to just take a few minutes to sort of remember why Merce matters, why this work matters, why a major contemporary art museum would put together a program like this. Of an exhibition like this, and why we're having these conversations. Just as a reminder, Merce was from Centralia, Washington. He grew up taking dance classes, and he studied the arts at the Cornish School in Seattle before moving to New York City at the invitation of Martha Graham to dance with her company. And he did that for about 7 years. And during those 7 years, he created some seminal roles in the Graham Company, including the preacher in Appalachian Spring. But he also began to realize in the course of that time with Martha that this was not the kind of work that he wanted to do. He began making his own work in the mid-1940s. And it really sprang out of a love of dancing. And as we think about Merce, I always tell people the most important thing you need to understand is he loved to dance. He just loved to dance. And everything that sprang out of that love is still with us right now. He became involved in the mid-40s, both artistically and personally, with John Cage. And John's influence on where Merce went artistically and aesthetically is kind of impossible to overstate. John, of course, was part of an emerging movement in new music and sound that really was veering away from the agreed-on rules about music and traditional music theory in favor of experiment, in favor of the new, in favor of the unknown and the unattempted. And together, these two guys were really at the vanguard of an avant-garde that emerged in the 1950s in the live arts world, and as well as its intersections with the visual arts. It was a world with Merce that was rejecting drama, rejecting narrative, rejecting psychological information and expression in favor of human movement and its infinite possibilities. So several innovations that Merce is credited with. I often, when I'm teaching dance history and get to Cunningham, I tell my students that I think Merce was the corner, the pivot, the turn from modernism to postmodernism. He has a number of innovations that really set whole new directions for dance. One of the most important ones that he and John came up with together was separating dance from music. I love the title of this exhibition, Common Time. And one of the ways that we can read that title of the exhibition is that when Merce would say to John, I'm going to make a new dance, it's going to be 20 minutes long, why don't you make the music? John would go off and create 20 minutes of material, and Merce would go into the studio and create 20 minutes of material, and they would put the two together at the last minute. So it was a very different way of collaborating. I'll talk about that again in a little while. But what this decision did was it freed dance to be its own discourse. It freed dance to stand on its own feet, if you'll pardon the pun, without the traditional relationship of either illustrating music or being driven syntactically by the music or trying to bring the music alive through the human body. Now, that work continued to happen and does to this day, but that is not what Merce was doing. And that separation was part of opening up possibilities for what dance could be and could become. He also introduced the egalitarian use of space. He encountered a statement by Albert Einstein, there are no fixed points in space, and Merce decided that that struck him as theatrically right. And there's a wonderful little story that many of you have probably heard. I love to tell it. In around 1996, there was a big celebration at BAM, which was hosted by Garrison Keillor. And Garrison Keillor did a lot of research in preparing for this, and he made up a story, but it is a wonderful apocryphal story, where he said that when Merce was a little boy, he tried playing baseball. But the coach eventually had to tell him to leave the team because young Merce kept insisting that home plate was wherever you were standing. It's apropos for the opening of baseball season, right? But this value of space and the decentering of space, because the agreed-on rule is that center stage is, of course, the most important point in the theatrical space. Merce threw that out the window. And when you see his work, you see the use of space in very unusual and innovative ways that don't depend on foregrounding any one territory over another. Another thing that he did was, of course, famously using chance procedure and chance operations as a choreographic tool. He did it in a variety of ways until the early 1990s when using a software program that was then called Lifeforms. It's now available as Dance Forms. He began to use that tool to randomize movement and began to explore through chance what kind of phrasing could happen. Merce was the master of the phrase, and chance procedures really allowed him to explore that. I always like to remind people that the use of chance operations was Merce's way of discovering new possibilities. In a sense, it was philosophical, but I've always felt it was more about Merce finding ways to be surprised. He often said that using chance gave him ideas and possibilities that he wouldn't have thought of on his own, and opened ways for him to think about movement that he just wouldn't have thought of if he was dependent only on his own imagination. This use of chance and indeterminacy was a key component in this additional area about collaboration that Cunningham's innovations included. When Merce decided to make a new dance, as I've said, he would go to John or to another composer, and he would go to a visual artist. In the early years, it was most frequently Robert Rauschenberg. Many other people collaborated with him over time. But he would invite them to contribute something. There would be minimal interaction during the creative process, and it would all come together at the end. And each artist would work independently while they were working. And this was artistically risky business. But it was also an indicator of the trust that these people put into the imaginations of their peers. Their curiosity exceeded their need to control, and they trusted what the outcome would be. And Merce himself said sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't, but they always gained things by letting the procedure go ahead and interact without trying to control things. The last area of Merce's innovations I want to mention revolves around his interest in new technology. In the 1970s, he began to experiment with film. He collaborated with a number of people, including Charles Atlas, learning about the camera's eye and cinematic space, which is very different from theatrical three-dimensional space. In starting to use dance forms, he again deployed the unfamiliar as a means of making new discoveries. And his great late work Biped uses motion capture technology and animation created by Paul Kaiser and Shelley Eshkar, projected on a scrim at the front of the stage on which live dancers performed some of Merce's hardest and most complex work. His curiosity with these binary resources blazed a trail that continues to this day. But none of this could have happened if Merce, who, as I've said, loved to dance, had been dancing alone. Across his 60-year project, multiple generations of dancers joined the company, were trained by Merce, danced the work Merce gave them, and moved on to other things. When I think of Merce's legacy, I think, of course, of the dances and the steps. I think of the body of work by him and his collaborators, so much of which we get to look at here at the Walker. I think about his innovations, but most of all, I think about his dancers. They, I believe, are his living legacy. And we have 3 of them here with us tonight. Actually, we have several of them with us, but we got 3 who are going to be chatting in the conversation. And we're going to be talking about the experience of working with Merce and being in his company and how his impact continues now. So could you guys come on up and I'll introduce you a little bit, and then we'll get into the conversation. This is Patricia Lent, Andrea Weber, Silas Riener. Yay! And let me tell you a little bit about each of them. Patricia Lent, who we call Trish, was a company member from 1984 to 1993, and she began teaching Cunningham technique and repertory workshops at the Merce Cunningham studio in the late 1980s. She is a master restager of Cunningham works, a trustee of the Merce Cunningham Trust, and she serves as the Trust's Director of Licensing. Maybe she'll tell us a little bit about what that involves. In the mid-1990s, after she left MCDC, that's the shorthand for Merce Cunningham Dance Company, she danced with White Oak Dance Project, and she devoted 9 years to teaching 2nd and 3rd graders at PS 234 in Lower Manhattan. She has staged Merce's work in a number of major companies that you would recognize. I'll mention American Ballet Theater, Lyon Opera Ballet, and she is one of the people who's really continuing to move the work out there into the world. Andrea Weber danced with MCDC from 2004 to its closure at the end of the Legacy Tour at the end of 2011. She performed roles in over 35 of Merce's works, and she's now a restager of Cunningham works as well as a teacher of Cunningham technique. And I should mention that the events that we're doing this right now here at the Walker, and that we also got to see in Chicago a few weeks ago because there is a Common Time exhibition there as well. Andrea assembled and staged them, working with the 4 dancers that we'll see performing. She's taught Cunningham technique and repertory at numerous colleges and universities and festivals, including Brown University and American Dance Festival in Durham, North Carolina, and has set Merce's work for a number of major national and international companies, including the Stephen Petronio Company, which has Rainforest in its repertory. And now Silas Riener joined the company in 2007 and continued until its closure at the end of 2011. In 2012, he was honored with a Bessie, that's a New York Dance and Performance Award, for his solo performance in Merce's work Split Sides. While he was in the company, let me repeat that, while he was in the company, he completed an MFA in dance at New York University. And again, while still in the company, he began a collaboration in 2010 with choreographer Rashawn Mitchell. That collaboration continues now, and some of you may have seen their recent work, Tesseract, which is also a collaboration with Charles Atlas. It was done here in Minneapolis, I think just a few weeks ago. And we got it in Chicago too, so we got to see it. It was really great. So, very busy people. And thank you all for taking some time to have this conversation. I want to start by plunging straight into the studio. You all had the privilege of being the people on whom Merce would build material. Could you take us into that experience? He made often difficult, complex material. And I would love to hear a little bit about how the process of learning that material went, and then how you kept it. And then all 3 of you have been involved in restaging and reviving material of various kinds. In relation to the experience of actually being in the studio with Merce, what's it like now to restage and reconstruct things in this sort of post-Cunningham era that we're in? So long, big question. Anybody can dive in. Maybe we should start with Trish, since you're I'm going to just pick on you.
Because you're looking at me.
I'm looking at you.
Well, I mean, it's very nice to be invited back into the studio, because that was the place where we worked most directly with Merce. And you know, there's 2 different ways of learning material. There's the material you learned in class, and then there's the material you learned in a dance. And you know, the class primary purpose was to make us strong and able to do the work. But he also Merce would also try out some phrases, some material. You could almost tell. I mean, in my time in the company, he typically made 3 new dances a year, and there were times in between when I think he was always working on a dance. But there'd be a day in class where suddenly what he was giving in class had a little more something to it, and it reminded you a little bit of something that you did the day before, and there was a little more intensity in the way that he shared it. But basically, he gave us instructions, and Merce was not in the wheelchair when I was in the company. He was standing up, and he was giving instructions by showing. He was using his voice somewhat, but mostly by demonstrating. And it was our job to see what it was, and then to try to do it, and to try to do it, sort of make the most of it you could. And because it was a group. I mean, I think it's important what you said, that he wasn't dancing alone. We weren't dancing alone either. You looked around, and sometimes there was something I couldn't do, and so I'd look for somebody who could, and you'd say, see if that worked or something else worked. That's kind of what I remember about those early phrases.
Yeah, I'll only add, in my time, later on when he was in the wheelchair and the instructions were really all that you had to go on, the process of acquiring material from Merce, in some ways it got more intense, or I don't know what it was like in your time, but it felt really intense because there was so little to go on sometimes. And sometimes it felt like that was a great amount of license and creative freedom. And sometimes it felt like, oh, I want to make sure that I am doing the thing that he wants me to do. So there was kind of a knife's edge that I felt like we were on. There was also, in my and Andrea, for the most part, also in Andrea's time, the presence of a group of dancers that Merce worked with, the repertory understudy group. And so if the company was away, or oftentimes on Merce's new dances, he would work primarily with the understudy group, and then the understudy group would in turn transfer the material to the company. So there was kind of an added level of translation, which went on.
It was complicated. That period of time of the understudies taking over some of the learning process was a complicated time period for the company and for the understudies. I just might add that I came to the studio later, and so there were 2 things definitely for me as well, like the classwork and the repertory. And this class that you take was nothing like anything else in New York, at least for me. So finally finding this rigorous technique that sort of did everything I could possibly want in a class, but go somewhere else, I just found it riveting. And so it was a place I really, really wanted to be. But then stepping into this day that you're in the company, and all of a sudden you're doing Merce's repertory, and my group was the first group that, my understudy group was the first group that worked with Merce in choreography, and just like that, we were learning these phrases that I didn't even know how to comprehend them from the technique class. Like he actually, one of the first things he did with the 4 of us, he called me forward and grabbed my hips just to explain to me really what a twist meant, because I had no idea what I was doing. So I have to be honest and say that I think that there was a lot of anxiety that I thrived off of, but it was there the whole time. So.
Yeah. What about restaging it now? What kind of challenges are you faced with in bringing this work to people who don't necessarily have that daily training and that daily working with those phrases in class? How does that operate?
Sometimes better than others.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, I also feel like I've been involved in a couple of stagings, certainly not as many as either of the 2 of you, but just to have Merce's notes sometimes, or to be on the other side of things, because Merce did often create copious notes about the dance that he was creating, there's a really different level of access into his thinking or his psyche than we would normally be afforded on the dancer side of things. He didn't tell us a lot what was going on. I mean, I was only involved in one new creation of Merce's, but mostly it was instructions, and the instructions accumulated until the point that then he was done, and then we would do the piece. On the flip side, with a restaging or a reconstruction, there's this complicated task of trying to figure out what they were doing on the video or what the notes say, or how to get the new group of dancers that you're working with to embody something that makes it look like Merce's work. And it's not always the same things that you have to communicate. It's not just about the form. And so for myself, that's been the most interesting challenge of restaging, is how do I impart the spirit of this work to these people that never met Merce, maybe never saw the company, that to get them to understand that dimension of it, that's a really interesting task to me.
You know, Merce had enormous charisma, and he also, we relied on him. I mean, we didn't do anything on stage until he told us what to do. So we had this constant relationship with him, almost I wouldn't say needy, but he was, well, needy is not so bad, you know. He was sending us material, and so you do anything, you try anything, and there was a lot of satisfaction because the material was interesting. And I think when I stage, one thing I have to acknowledge is that I don't carry that level of charisma. And it's not okay for me to just say, well, step on your right foot and then step on your left foot and expect any kind of magic to happen. I have to find some other way to engage that spirit, to let the dancers know that they can really put themselves into it. And one thing that I use a lot, and I know I've watched both of you stage, so I know you do as well, is that there's this idea that we danced in silence, which is not exactly true, especially in the beginning when he was teaching us the movement. We were dancing with his voice and with his clapping and with his rhythm. And so one of the things that I've done, and one thing that I've always encourage other people who are staging to do, is to allow yourself to keep using your voice, and and what do I mean? Ya da da, and down and up and around and
rhythm,
over.
yeah.
That is the soundtrack that we rehearsed to until such time as the dance really got going. But that's underneath the material. So even if you don't know the soundtrack of that particular phrase, you figure something out.
Yeah, and the rhythm and the torso movements, I try to, even if there's not time for class, give those things in the beginning of a reconstruction so that they're starting to get sort of the basic into the piece. But yes, the rhythms, absolutely. The other thing that, I don't know if you guys agree with this, but when you're in the company, Merce gives you a lot of space to work on something and find your way. There's not that time and space in a reconstruction. So oftentimes you have to make choices right from the beginning of what it's going to be, and then potentially, if everything goes well, you can give more space in the end. It's almost a reversal sometimes. I don't know.
It's tricky.
It's tricky.
Engaging with the degree of freedom that we had and autonomy.
Yeah. There was clarity about what we were going for, but we had time to play in it.
I think that's one of the challenges of what the future holds, because I think things tend to the impulse is to harden something, to fix it. And I know, having known many of the dancers over going back to the late 70s, that one of the things that everyone talks about is that freedom, that these are the steps, but it's also me trying to solve this. And how that gets conveyed going down the pike is a very interesting challenge, and not everybody's going to solve it in the same way, I guess.
I hope not.
And yes, exactly. Yeah. So when you were in the company, what did you kind of read or sense Merce working on? I mean, we have the luxury now of this 60-year project. It's completed. There won't be any new dances. There won't be any new collaborations. There will be new events, perhaps, but that's about as far as we can get in terms of new material. And so we have the luxury of looking at it. But when you're in it, did you have a sense of him working on something in particular? How he was shaping something, or what particular phrasing he was trying to dig around at? Do you have a memory of that?
I have a significant thing that happened when I was first in the company, and that was Merce changed into his wheelchair. And I feel like this was a physical challenge at first. And I feel like we all felt that in the first piece that he did from that place.
Which work was that, Andrew?
It was Views,
Oh, it was Views
for
on
stage
stage.
and Views for film. It was a darker year, and the movements were so dense. So we weren't in space and moving around space as much as, well, I had little experience at that point. But all of the repertory pieces that I had already done, this was my first new piece, and it was so vastly different than anything else. I mean, we did so many things just in one spot, but with not only legs, but arms and torsos and heads on top of it. So that was a significant shift. And then I think he went out from there again, but it was noticeable to all of us.
I mean, I think the work that I stepped into, because there was, there's a whole repertory. So the first thing you do is
Exactly.
you learn somebody else's parts. You put on somebody else's, not their shoes, but everything else,
Kind of.
and you inhabit these roles. And the dances were complex at that time, but the actual movement was not anywhere near as complex as the in a shape and intricacy way that it became. There was a lot of like one and another and something else, and one and another and something else, kind of. And then what I saw immediately is that there was a huge priority on traveling largely through the space and taking big steps and being down in your plie, and and the legs were flying, and you could just look around the room and see that. And as a young dancer, and I was a very inexperienced dancer when I joined the company, I just tried to get on the boat and stay with everybody and do that. And then the complexity came with the intricacies of the group. He, had 15 dancers, hadn't had 15 dancers for that long, and was enjoying that largeness in the group. But for me, there was a shift, and it wasn't due to a physical change in Merce. It was due to he suddenly, after all of this really clear and countable rhythms, he started saying, okay, do this phrase, but make it different each time. Make the rhythm different each time. And this was so upsetting to me because I loved the rhythms. That was my way in. That's where I felt at home. And suddenly he's saying, make it a little changed. And I eventually got to sort of like it, and that also came with a thing about falling. There was a whole series of dances, Loose Strife, August Pace. I think the king of it all was Change of Address, where we were just losing our balance. And this was after, I spent like 8 years getting my balance. And now I'm supposed to lose my balance. That was fun. But but there was definitely a sense of different things that were interesting him at different times.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. I do remember many times him sort of trying to get me to have the steps that I was doing surprise me with the way that they were accented, or the rhythms that were going on at the same time as each other. So I feel like he certainly seemed to continue with that. and also with the movement just getting more and more dense at the end. I do feel, too, in the classes that he was teaching in that time, the 2007 to 2009 time, I mean, maybe it was always like this, but it just felt extreme. Super extreme, slow things, extremely fast things, extremely small things. And I don't know if that was just an interest at the time. I think that with Nearly 90, the piece that was created on me, there are these moments in the piece where you have like a couple steps and you have to get like all the way to the other side of the stage. And I feel like with proposals like that, I don't know if they were challenges in his mind, but they felt like challenges to me at that time. I really wanted to be a kind of extreme dancer.
I always wondered about that, though. Like, in a new piece, was he like, okay, this is what I want Andrea to do now, so I'm going to make her move fast or whatever, or I'm just going to make her stand still for 90 minutes. It felt like that was what I did in the early 90s.
There was a lot about that piece, too, that felt very tailored to the people that he was working with at that time, the group of us that were there at the end.
But who knows, you know?
But he did that, didn't he? I mean, with earlier generations of dancers.
I think it was always faster. The tempo was always a little bit faster than you are currently doing.
Right.
And I think faster got faster over the decades. But when a lot of people felt that with the onset of the filmmaking picked up the tempo significantly. All the older dancers were complaining when I was there, and they weren't that old. You know, they just got there before I did. They were all complaining that everything was faster and everything was on releve. And then, you know, I found myself 5 years later, everything's faster, everything's on releve. You know? So I think whatever fast was got faster, whatever was slow, he found slower.
Yeah.
For a while, he wasn't so interested in slow. It seemed like he
went away from that a little bit, and then came back to it.
But it was pushing.
But he would sometimes set a tempo and tap a tempo very differently. So like 1, 2, 3 would turn into 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
Oh, and how you kept up with it. Excuse me. What were you all working on in your own dancing?
The freedom or the windows within the movement that people talk about. I found that, but it took me a long time. It was not obvious to me at first. I was just trying to, why do I put the word just in there? I was trying to do the movement clearly and strongly and accurately and fully. That there was space in there, that there were options about how to do that was something I needed to discover. It took me a while. I think that comes much more naturally to you. I think no, I do. I mean, I think people have certain people ride the edge differently, you know, and I think
I think I just didn't know how little I knew. Maybe a little bit more. I mean, I didn't have time in the understudy group to kind of get acclimated to the culture of the company.
It's an important time,
I missed out on that time, and I really just went right into like doing it and was like, oh, just do it like this. I don't know. And sometimes it went okay, and other times I feel like there were things going on that were way over my head.
Well, especially because there had been this transfer of the understudies learning new material from Merce. So if you sort of skipped that period, you skipped, you know, that
boot camp.
Yeah, but also that time with him, you know. Not that didn't happen, it wasn't 100% in the new work, but it became more and more significant. The first piece, it was 2 sections. The second piece, it was 4 sections, and then, you know, it evolved, so for sure.
But
I forgot about that, actually.
I think that arc that you're sort of trying to describe of like getting there and really not knowing what's going on, and then slowly kind of building your own awareness as things become a little bit more familiar, that feels very like, I feel like that's partly the shape of it. And it was how Merce was kind of poking at you and pushing you and prodding you into new and unfamiliar territory. That's kind of the shape of what was going on. I mean, I think I was young when I joined. I was 23 when I joined the company, and so I just really wanted to dance, and I was super excited all the time about all these crazy, weird, extreme, cerebral tasks, and so all of the new things felt very exciting, and there kept being new things.
And I got into the company later, 28, and I was just so ecstatic to finally have a job that I almost feel the same way. That at first I was just like, this is incredible. But I do feel like I just worked. I wish I was working all the time, and I wish I had breathed more and had trusted like finding a little more freedom. I see that now on the other side of, oh wow, you know, I wasn't breathing for 8 years, you know.
That's a long time. You look great.
Yeah, I don't know if it was that extreme, but I you know, it's like, oh, okay.
What kinds of discoveries have you made since leaving the company? Since
And
separating
I didn't breathe
yourselves?
for 8 years. No, just kidding.
I mean, you've
Yeah.
started breathing again. We're thankful. But about the work and what Merce was trying to do and what this project was. And I'm wondering, Silas, if you might start, because you've come back to it now after close to 5-year absence, except for occasional visits. How is it working to come back?
It's going okay. It's very strange because the company closed when I was 28 years old, and I really didn't feel done in my body. I think a lot of people, when they leave the company, it's because they are used up or spent in some kind of way physically, or just tired of it, or for many different reasons. But I still felt like there was more there for us, for Merce and I, to discover. And so to come back to it partially feels like I'm able to get some of that discovery. I think it's great. I mean, it's amazing to come back and be like my old friend. I mean, some of my old friends are more painful than others, but it's so familiar. You've done it so many times. The framework of the choreography is so it's a specific worldview. And so that feels both very comforting and stable, and also still very, I mean, I would say more rich and exciting now because I think I know a little bit more about it. I've had some time and some perspective, and it's really nice to come back and feel a little bit more mature than I think I was at the time. It's not so painful, and we're not doing it so much that it doesn't feel totally alien. But also, you know, on the side of things of creating my own work and these collaborations and dancing for other choreographers, there are so many more things that are unknown and unfamiliar and unfixed that I bounce around a lot more, I think, or I ask a lot more questions of people. And I feel like with Merce's work, I understand where the questions are, and it feels, I don't know, the work just feels so strong to me. It's always been challenging trying to make work in response or in just for anyone to try and make a dance after being involved with Merce Cunningham to the extent that many of us were. He's always with you in every step, in every moment. A shading of a moment will happen. I'll be like, oh, I know that moment. So I feel like getting out from under that level of surveillance is part of the practice of making new work and releasing myself from all of that. But it has been, I don't know, it's been a joy to come back to working with the other dancers that have been involved in this show. It's really awesome and weird and regressive and special.
Yeah, to be on the other side of it and watch you guys, it's a treat every day. It really is. I'm savoring it.
Well, Andrea, you and Trish both have done a lot of restaging with students with professional companies, and I'm wondering if you had moments of discovery in doing that about the work.
Moments doesn't even get
Yeah, no, constant,
close to
constant.
it. I think for me, before I got into staging the work, I started teaching class at the studio pretty early after I had joined the company, and I knew that was something I liked doing. I loved class. I loved the structure of class. I loved that the day started with class, and that was my job to be there. And I loved the progression of the day and how it worked with that within the structure. And I had, at that time, there were these 1 week repertory workshops at Westbeth, and I taught, I don't know, 10 or 12 of them. But it was, you teach a little piece. It was, by Thursday you're talking about the showing and it's finished. But I learned, a fair amount about that. It was fun. I knew a lot of the dances, so I was basically going from what I knew about the dances and what I could catch off of a video. That's what I was doing. But when I really started to think about what I had learned from Merce is when I was in the classroom with second graders. Because there are things about pacing and sharing information in an efficient way. I mean, with a second grader, you have about 7 minutes of sitting still. And the next 7 minutes, you may have something to say, but you're going to spend 3 of the minutes getting everybody to stay where they are. And maybe we were a little bit like that for Merce, because he moved along. There wasn't a lot of lingering or talking, or this dance is all about such and such, or I really want he just kept moving, and somehow the belief that activity and doing it again, well, what if we do it again? How about one more time? Was worth a lot more than talking about how we were going to do it again. So that I brought into the classroom, and then when I went back into staging, I was like, I brought my second graders back into the work. So there's been a bit of that in my life. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I feel like I'm just getting started. So it's just all of the things that, as a dancer I could have done differently in the work, seeing the piece on the outside and really understanding how complex the spacing, or I've staged Pondway 3 times, and I cannot believe the spacing works every time. It just works. You give the dancers their movements and how many, and it works. And then gaining confidence each time, maybe making a bolder choice or a different choice. And I think one of the best things so far, and like I said, I'm just starting this part of my career, and thank you so much, is the opportunity to co-stage the work and learn from that other person. The Trust does these fellowship workshops where we can apply and work with another dancer or ourselves and reconstruct a piece. And I've done a few of those, and I've worked with Meg Harper specifically on a couple of stagings, and that information is tremendous, especially when you're working with someone from a different time period, but even someone from your own time period, of just how they, sometimes you don't know exactly what the rhythm is. You think you might be certain about it, but it can be counted different ways and still end up being the same, and or pacing. Oh, that was a good idea. I'll do that next time. So there's tons of learning. It's going to keep going. Yeah.
Well, I've been following Merce's work myself since around 1980, and I still see new things all the time.
Yeah.
And I'm not like you all. I didn't do it. I've just been watching. And it's still a fountain of possibility for me,
Yeah.
a new discovery. And some of that has to do with the steps themselves and the way he would create a piece and how it could be a unified whole using such a limited vocabulary in such an unusual context. But some of it was just the larger project of working with John or working with Morty Feldman or working with Rauschenberg or Jasper, or, I mean, the list goes on and on. It just keeps inviting you back in. And of course, he was so good at letting you decide what it was, because he wasn't going to tell you. So it's just this fountain of youth in a way for me. And I think a lot now, of course, about idea of legacy. The trust was created long before Merce passed, to be the repository and keeper of his works. But I think now that the Cunningham Trust is fully holding that legacy, there are many different streams of activity. And I wonder, for all of you as former dancers and people who are still both intellectually and physically engaged in different ways with this material, what you're thinking about the legacy. What is it now? Where can it go? What do you see happening, and what can and should happen? That's a very open-ended big question.
Well, I have a few thoughts about it.
As well you should.
Patricia should go first.
One is that the people who knew and worked with Merce in various capacities, not only the dancers, but musicians and artists and administrators and friends, are an enormous resource. And Merce was very generous while you were there in the company, but you never had the opportunity to leave the company, so you don't know about this. But when you left, it really felt like you could just hear the door go click. It really, and it wasn't out of cruelty. It was just that, I mean, I think it's hard to even say it, but you'd sort of become irrelevant
He
to
moved
the
on.
project.
Sure, yeah.
The project was moving on with another group of people. I feel very grateful to have had a chance to come back into the work. And when I came back into the work, the dancers who are performing here, and Andrea were the dancers. That was the company that was the group that I walked in and started working. So I think one aspect of the legacy has to be to get that door opened, and I keep trying to open it and figuring out a way for people to participate and contribute. And then the other side of it, the other main thing I think of is that we have to be prepared to trust and respect and honor the approximations that are going to exist in the future in this work. People have to be allowed to inhabit the work. Audiences need to be able to see the work. They need to be able to go and see, like I heard there was a performance of sound dance in New York, and someone said, "How did I miss that dance? I never saw that dance. It's the first time I ever saw sound dance." And I just thought, great. Like, no, I don't need to go over there and say, well, it used to be, like, it doesn't matter. Like, there it is, there's sound dance, and that person just had that experience of sound dance. And those dancers that are inside the work, we need to allow it to be their dance. In the same way that we all, as dancers in the company, had the opportunity for it to be our dance. And the people who'd done our dances before weren't 100% happy with how we inhabited it, but I think that's a really key issue.
Just so you know, my students who are in their 20s now saw Ballet de Lorraine do sound dance and were like, I never saw a dance like this in my life. So it's still doing that thing that it does.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think I completely agree. And I don't know that I will even take a stab at would, like future. But I think that the opening of the door to, who's next to stage the work and teach it, I'm interested in that, of, having someone in the room with me to, not just have them be part of it, so that they're teaching it and we're doing that together. Yeah, I guess that's all I have to say. Yeah, I'm going to be careful on this one. Yeah.
I have a couple of thoughts about it. One of them is maybe just a really basic thing as a point of departure, but that there are lots of different places that the work resides. And one of them, for me, is in my physical body. The knowledge exists in my body. There's other ways of watching the work, and it exists on an intellectual level. And I think that leads me to think. I don't think I'm proposing answers or even maybe very good ideas, but think about what is the work? What are we talking about when we're talking about Merce's work? Is it the dance that we saw? Is it the notes that he made and then the dancer that he hired and then his relationship with that dancer over time and then the choices that dancer made in response to what Merce said or demonstrated, and then all of that put together times 15 with a backdrop and some costumes and a bunch of crazy music. There's a lot of ways that I think we're only now getting to consider that I'm starting to consider that maybe Merce's designs existed well outside of all of that, and maybe that whole universe is a thing that was his work. And I feel like there are still many, many things to learn and discover about the work once we figure out what it is. Mm-hmm.
Well, it has a philosophical aspect, what he and John were doing with indeterminacy, with... He said once, no, I think it was John who said that we bring the music and the dance and the decor together for the convenience of the audience. But the belief that the universe would take care of itself aesthetically, in a way. And I don't know people who are working that way now. I think maybe some are. But I wonder, I'm going to go down a rabbit hole here. I know that all of you in teaching activities have sometimes introduced chance procedure to students. I've done it. I've taught in the studio using the chance procedure methods. And I'm wondering if you have recollections of discoveries that people made by trying to build work that way, or even if you've choreographed using it.
I think one thing that I'm stepping back one question, but I'm heading that direction. I mean, I think one of the things that's been fascinating for me in the past 4 or 5 years is looking inside of Merce's notebooks, where he records the structure and it's not. He doesn't really record. He's making notes for himself. He did not make these notes for me. It wasn't so that I could stage the dance later. It was so that he could get to rehearsal. That's what those notebooks were for. But you can glean evidence from them of the structure of particular dances and of how chance was used in particular dances. This is not something I knew about when I was in the company. I mean, I was busy being in it. But now it's, especially with the dances that I know very well, and in which the notes happen to be clear, you can see how they're structured. It's like looking inside a watch. I mean, talk about a rabbit hole. Wow. I can go down there for a really long time, and it's fascinating, and it helps staging, and sometimes it gets in the way of staging because I'm so caught up in my wonky, interest in how this whole thing's fitting together. And I'm not myself a choreographer, but I do feel that there's information in there that I know about, that I've learned about because of my involvement in the work and my involvement in staging, that would be interesting to share with choreographers. And a lot of us have been talking about that with each other. Young dancers, yes, and also really experienced choreographers, like making it clear that chance operations wasn't about leaving the dance up to chance. It was about subjecting certain decisions to chance built in within this complex, elegant structure that had also been built by the person throwing the dice.
Right.
It's really fascinating what he did, and I would like to figure out a way to share that.
That would be so interesting, because I think one of the things that people sometimes forget is that in order for chance to work, you have to set up the questions.
Well, and which questions?
And that's the point, is Merce became such a master at setting up the questions, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think the limited experience I've had with working with young dancers and choreographers and students, introducing first the idea of chance procedures and the idea of indeterminacy and the idea that they're different,
Yes.
and that Merce used both of these procedures in addition to his own choices. Quickly, what becomes very clear is that it is so much work. Merce prepared so many things before stepping into the studio with his dancers. And that, to me, it's really cool that you can share that with people, and quickly it becomes, people get either really excited about, oh, well, if I ask it like this, or if I use this kind of aleatoric method, then I can have it come out this way, or they become completely rebuffed by the whole, I could just make my own choice. I'll just walk up to the stage and go over there, and then I just did it.
Yeah.
So there's an alienation factor that I find challenging, millennially challenging. But if these beautiful structures that he puts in place in the dances, in the notes, which none of us ever have any awareness of in the studio, if there's a way to impart them, I think it's very special.
Incredible, yeah.
Because you feel them like these invisible castles in the dances, but you don't ever really know until you're like, oh, wow, no, this is unbelievable.
He was so full of surprises. A friend of his who lives in Europe told me a story once, and I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble for telling this story or not. Maybe.
There's no police here.
Okay, there's no police here. She said there was, and she did not remember what dance it was, so that's good in a way. But she said there was a section of a dance that she saw the dancers do, and she commented to Merce about it and how impressed she was with it, and he said, "Oh, I choreographed that to some salsa music in my living room."
Well, there's
So-
in his notes
what piece
there's
was it?
there's she doesn't know.
Oh.
I don't know which
No,
dance
but
it was.
in his notes there's little, sometimes in the margins there'll be song titles. Like there's a section of oratorio that says Yankee Doodle, and I thought Yankee Doodle, but if you do the steps, it's like Yankee Doodle went to London, da-na-na-na, and it's hilarious, you know. And then there's a lot of romantic kind of torch songs that get written in there. So you know there were all sorts. He was having all sorts of ideas. It's just he didn't think that the purpose of his dance was to convey them to you. The purpose of those ideas was to make a dance, and then your job was to look at the dance and see what you saw. You know.
I'm
Yeah.
glad we didn't have any of that information. Like, it was enough just doing the material. I didn't need to have any of that, you know.
Robert Swinston once told me he never told us not to be emotional. He was just giving us stuff that was so hard to do. All we could do was
We were
try to
completely
learn
in
how
the
to do
moment,
it.
completely present.
Well, I wonder if you all have questions.
Oh,
I see all kinds of hands going up. Yes.
So I'm going to take you back to the 60s.
Put my hair down.
I saw a lot of modern dance when I was at Cal in the 60s.
Okay.
I didn't understand any of it. It made no sense to me. And I thought there was something wrong with me that I couldn't figure it out. And then I saw a Merce Cunningham show performance in which people were walking. It was basically about walking. And I didn't really see, I mean, I didn't understand that, but then the next day I found myself walking differently. And I realized he was deconstructing walking. And, I mean, maybe he didn't mean this, but he was telling the audience, you might think about how you walk before you're going to try to do anything else. So what can you tell me about that?
Well, I can say quickly that Merce and his peer Paul Taylor in the 50s and 60s, part of what they were proposing to their audiences was that everyday movement was a valid presence in a dance concert, that it was a valid resource. They went in very different directions aesthetically, but both of them were working out of that sort of modality of everyday movement as one of their key resources. But I don't know which dance it was. I think it's a little hard to...
Well, in a way, I don't think it really matters, because I think what happened for you, and it was the same experience that I had, and I had had a lot of experience with dance before I first saw Merce's work, is that you were drawn to the activity on stage, and you were looking at the activity, and you weren't saying, what does this activity mean? You were just looking at the activity. And I think that nothing would have made Merce happier than to know that there were people in the audience who were engaged with the activity and that found a connection between that activity and the activity out in life. Because I think that's what I saw. I said, those people are busy, those people are strong. I want to go get involved with what those people are doing. That was, as a youngster seeing it, yeah.
Yes.
This has really been bugging me, and you are the people who will have the answers to these questions. Both nuts and bolts questions about how the dances work, sort of, or what his process was, sort of. The first one is, you keep talking about instructions, and I'm not a dancer. What are the instructions? Can you give a couple examples? What does that mean?
Lift your leg to the front. Go
Put your
to the
arm
right.
to the side.
Yeah.
Turn
so
around.
It's for a very specific moment within this, what did you call it? The mystical castle or invisible
Sure.
castle?
I
So
don't
if
remember.
that's the dance.
Oh, the invisible
as a whole,
castle.
This would be just like one little,
Yeah.
tiny little bit of it. He would say, lift your leg.
Or like
da-da-da-da.
take your right leg and cross it over your left.
Was
now-
that for everybody or just for you?
It would
in that one
depend. It would
moment?
depend if the phrase was, if a group of people were all learning that, and that became a little more complicated because there was different interpretations, which I think was okay.
And that idea of a phrase, one thing that's true, I think, about almost all the dances is that it's made up of discrete phrases, which are manipulated and changed, and some people are doing different phrases and some people are doing the same phrases, but they're sequences of movement. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes long, and they're made up of movements like put your leg up and put your leg down, and if you do it a few times, you've got a phrase, sort of. But they're knowable chunks of movement.
Yeah, and there's a lot of triplet phrases as well in his work. So, down, up, down, 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 up, down. Yeah, in different rhythms and different ways, a 3, a 5.
And sometimes the instructions would come with a rhythmic component. So you would know what the rhythm was, and things would fit into that. And sometimes you would learn the movement first, and then it would be structured into a rhythm. Or sometimes it would just have no rhythm, and it would just be one thing after another, after another, after another.
Well,
Yeah,
my
and
other
time
question-
go
go ahead.
Time is very important. So Trish mentioned like a certain amount of time. So we rehearsed to a stopwatch. And so, this solo might be a minute and a half. And when we go back, if it was 2 minutes, that was too long, So time was part of our constant dialogue.
Well, the second question's sort of the other part of it is space. And Sage Coles, who would have loved to have been here,
Yeah.
said to me, but she didn't really explain it, and I've been trying to see it in the dances, and I'm not sure I know what it means, and I thought I'd ask you. She said there was sort of an imaginary grid, or maybe it was a real grid.
We didn't ourselves have the grid. That was Merce often had a grid in his preparations in his notes, and so he would use chance to figure out that you went from space 22 to space 3. He never ever told me to go from space 22 to space 3. He said this phrase of movement, just like the down, up, or whatever it is, and then he'd say do it 3 times, can you make it go there? And so then I would make it go there, and then he would tell Silas, can you do this phrase and make it go there? So
And then we would run into each other and have a fight and have to figure out who went first. And Merce would be like, just do it again.
so that the he used chants to primarily for the continuity of these phrases, which phrase followed which, and also where the phrases happened in space. And different dances, there were certain dances where the spatial component was a bigger part of, a more primary part of it. Like in my time, Loose Strife, Beach Birds were really sort of structured around space. And there are some where it was more about the continuity of the phrases was a bigger thing. So, but they both were always there because you have to do them in time and space.
Thank you.
I had the chance to see the notebooks from Pondway.
Uh-huh.
I was writing an article, and they were still at the studio at the time, and David Vaughn said, "Oh, it's up there somewhere." Found it. And there was a little pond drawn.
Yeah, sometimes.
You see this, and that's so he really, for somebody who is perceived as completely abstract, he was actually amazingly literal with what he was doing. And I think it's going to be very exciting as we go more into those resources and begin to explore them for the kind of insight that you're describing, Trish. Other questions? Yes.
I might have the total wrong impression, but I've studied his technique and studied with former dancers, and the impression I have is that he was kind of tough and that you would maybe perform and you wouldn't necessarily get feedback. So that could be totally a wrong perception, but that's the impression I have, and I would be so curious to know if that was true, and if it was, what that was like. I would find that really hard. I think I would need some, and not necessarily not any feedback, but I remember like Douglas Dunn saying that he like fell or he made a huge what he thought was a huge mistake, and it was never mentioned, and like years went by, and he still. And decades goes by, and he's like, I'll never know if that was a problem, or if he was mad, or if he was thrilled, or so I'm super curious about that.
There wasn't a lot of feedback.
No.
And I think for some people that was very, very hard. For some people it was liberating, I think. And I think a lot of us kind of went in and out different times. But the way I like to think about it, I wouldn't say tough. I wouldn't say he wasn't giving feedback because he was tough. I would say he wasn't giving feedback because he trusted us and he was already on to the next thing. Yeah. So that's what it felt like. It was our dance now, and he was already making the next dance, I think.
Yeah, that's what it felt like. I do remember, I was telling the other dancers about this. On my first tour, I think I'd had about 2 weeks of rehearsal with the company before going on my first tour, and it was 3 dances. I had to learn 2 of them, and we had our first rehearsal on the stage of the first theater, which was the Théâtre de la Ville in Paris. Never been to Europe before. I was on stage with the Merce Cunningham Dance Company, and we had our first rehearsal with the lighting, and it just was terrible. I was terrible. I thought they were going to send me home after that, and so I think that the freedom and the authority that we're talking about sometimes, where that lack of feedback or lack of congratulations. At times it was difficult, and at other times, or as I got to do the work more, and the feedback that would come would be about time and space and whether things worked out. To feel like a custodian of the work came to feel really, really good. And I think it's true that Merce was a lot of times when we would be working something out in a dance, and it would be like, well, I have to go over there, but I'm waiting for you, and that person is waiting for another person, and sort of finding out. All of that was sort of an internal. I don't think he had much interest in those sorts of things. If there was a a serious issue, or if he wanted to, like sometimes he would change things when new people took over in a role in a dance. He would tweak the timing or maybe change something a little bit based on maybe what that person was doing. And so there was, I think, I can't speak for anyone else in the company, but I feel like I felt watched. It wasn't disinterest on his part, that lack of feedback.
Sometimes, at least in our time period, when you first got into the company, you actually got a lot of attention. So sometimes it was, for me, it was nice when that went away a little bit, and I did have more space because I felt that trust. It wasn't like I didn't think he trusted me in the beginning. His eye just went somewhere else, and then, I don't know, it was like a sort of a rite of passage.
Yeah.
It's just leading directly on from that really interesting question, and it brought up ideas of restaging, and you guys were talking about restaging and letting different generations inhabit the work. And I guess my question is more about if there was, I don't want to refer to freedom necessarily, but how did you know if the work was done correctly or not? And therefore, how do you pass it on? Like, is there a right way and is there a wrong way of doing this?
There are a lot of right ways.
That's great, yeah.
In some ways, it was a communal experience, but it was also, we all had very different experiences. We had personal experiences and individual experiences and things about the work that really spoke to us. I just had a wonderful experience in a workshop and then staging a dance called Change of Address, which was one of my all-time favorites. And I was working with a colleague named Jean Freebury, and this was a dance, we went into it and we said, they are gonna fall. We are gonna make them move through space. And that was like, we just were so clear that that was the thing we wanted from that staging. Sometimes it's not quite so obvious, and you have to kind of figure out how to work with it. But, you know, we never knew what a dance was until it started to unfold. And sometimes you didn't know what it was. You thought you knew what it was, and then it went on stage, and the music and the decor came on, and it sort of changed it. And even when it went back into the studio without the music and the decor, it sort of was forever changed. It already had sort of shifted. So I think openness is important about what, you know, and if trying to make it right, trying to make it perfect is the thing that kills it dead, this work. It's so tempting. And I mean, I have killed it dead myself. I have personal experience with this. It is the thing. It's the thing that the work can't tolerate.
And you will make mistakes, bunches of them, even in a reconstruction.
You know, when I was doing Crowdspacer with Marcy, there's a lot of like 1 and 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. There's just, and all the ants are in different places. And Robert Swinston's first entrance, he does it alone, and then the group comes out, and I'd done this with him, and I was like, I'm sure of it, I know this phrase. He comes to watch, and he's like, that is completely wrong. The ant count is in the wrong place. And I was like, well, you know, and I changed it, and all the dancers saw it was funny. But actually, from the outside I was like, well, it doesn't really look different. At the end of the day, nobody else would have known, except for us in this room. And then it happened again in a different phrase, like the exact same phrase that two couples were doing, but the ant count was different in the one. And this person also came to the studio and was like, they're doing the ant count in the wrong place. I was like, I can't get in front of this piece.
I mean, I think it's an amazing question, and we were talking about it a little bit before, of how to resist fixing this person's work into stone, where clearly in his time when he was alive, he resisted that so clearly. So figuring out ways, I mean, I love that there are many ways of doing it right. Figuring out the right shape of the container to propose to dancers that are engaging with the work. my experience, my limited experience, is that it's very different depending on the group and depending on the person. That people are activated by different ways into this work, and that there's no one way to stage a Merce Cunningham dance. There's a lot of different kinds of information that people can have about this work, and that's good. I think that hopefully gives you some idea of what he was thinking about or what he was doing with his work.
One thing that's hard about staging is that the whole group is new. And for all of us, when we joined the company, whenever you joined, when Douglas Dunn joined the company, he entered a group that existed, and you had people, models, and people that were sort of more the leaders or whatever. And one of the difficulties in staging a work when you have a group that is all new to the work is that there's too many followers, and what they want to do is they want to follow the stager, and it's you are giving the information, but it's hard. It's sometimes I feel like I need to get out of the way, and I don't know how to do that. That's one of the things that I've, especially with younger dancers, with less experienced dancers.
It feels like that's the human part of this work. That there is no right and wrong. That the humanity of what's performing is it.
Maybe.
Well, Merce was not himself interested in restaging things. He would, somebody else would go and restage something to bring it back into the company or to put it on another company. And Merce might visit at some point and make comments. But he was always interested in the next dance. I think that's a fair thing to say. Somebody once asked Duke Ellington what's his favorite piece that he ever made, and his answer was the next one. And I think Merce was like that. He was always thinking about steps. Tom.
Yeah, his company, you guys have performed in many different places, and I'll from the quarry in St. Cloud, Minnesota, with an orchestra. I mean, all of these things that are bigger than just this stage. I remember the one that was the most impressive to me was right down here on Lake Street at a second floor ballroom that actually my parents met at. But it's a little wider than the stage there, but it was about that long, and there were 15 people out there, and I don't know if you were in that one. It was in the 80s, and it was incredible. But
yeah, it sounds a little. I think it was a little before me. Yeah.
Yeah, Chris Komar was in it. I remember him doing some kind of spin right in front of me, and there were like 4 rows all the way around the ballroom, and so there was a limited number of people, maybe 80 people watching, 15 people working their butts off. And Chris Komar, I remember spinning, and he's a lot of us got hit with his sweat. And I'll never forget that. But I just thought, wow, this is great, bringing modern dance to something that's like, it would be like having that whole company and I'm in the second row here. It was beautiful. Yeah. So, I mean, what other kind of...
Special venues?
Yeah, special venues did you...
A lot of museums
in
that
the
time
events,
period.
yeah.
A lot of museums, multi-stage events. The most was 5 stages. Is that correct?
We did end up getting very comfortable being that close.
Yeah.
And if you've come to the events here, we're right up there with you. And that really is a different thing than performing very far away from the audience in a kind of sea of black. So that was one thing that for me really shifted in the work when we were doing those events.
I remember Iowa City and the ballroom in Iowa City.
We had to dodge the
ballroom,
chandeliers
yeah.
in the ballroom.
It was just a low ceiling, and they were just dancing it out.
And then the opposite end of the spectrum, we did this tour. I mean, what a gift. We ringed the Mediterranean performing in amphitheaters. Like, you know, one was Roman, and there was the Palais de Pape in Avignon, and one after another. I mean, we were so tanned. You know, and the more tanned we would get, the harder Merce would make the classes, you know, just because he was afraid we were vacationing too much. But they were so unpredictable. Like bats would fly through, and I remember we were doing a performance in Barcelona, and 3 of the people in the company, Chris Komar and Karen Radford and Helen Barrow, were doing Cross Currents, and they were just exquisite, these 3 dancers. And it was kind of a long section, 7 minutes. And I guess they were having some kind of other celebration in the park on the other side, and the Waltz of the Flowers started playing. And it was getting louder and louder, and the musicians kind of just quieted down, and there's Karen and Helen, who were could have been in any ballet company, you know, out there doing Cross Currents. It was so fun, you know, and it kind of, it helped with the my perfectionist strain. It kept that, you know, under guard a little bit, because things were, you know, unknown.
We're almost out of time. I'm going to indulge, though, in one little story that's similar to Tricia's that Merce told me once, and I'm not going to get all the details right, but they were in Portugal, I believe. You may have been in the company when this happened. But there was you could open the back of the stage to a lake. So they opened the back of the stage, and the dancers, you weren't there? It was the Gulbenkian Center, I think, in Portugal. And there was some construction on the other side of the lake underway, and the dancers were dancing, and these guys were in this building doing construction beyond this lake behind them, and the construction workers started imitating what the dancers were doing during the dance.
Amazing.
No, that's not a Cunningham story. I never heard one. And Merce just loved that. Oh, he just loved that they were over there imitating what the dancers were doing. It's 8:30. It's time to stop. I want to thank Andrea and Trish and Silas for being here, and thank you all.
And thank you, Bonnie.
Make sure you see this exhibition if you haven't. It's glorious. Thanks so much.